Hello and welcome to the History of Japan podcast, episode 623, The Great Peace, Part 2. The first time that Emperor Go-Daigo's plot to overthrow warrior rule in Japan and restore the power of the imperial court was foiled, it was, at least according to Taiheiki, because of a woman. Specifically, the text lays blame on one Toki Yorikazu, one of the warriors involved in Go-Daigo's plot, who committed, the text says, the ultimate sin. He loved his wife too much. Quote, Yorikazu feared the coming parting with his beloved wife, saying to himself, "Not by one chance in 1,000 may I escape death when disturbance afflicts the realm and the hosts clash in battle." So it came about on a certain night when, after sleep, they too awakened to talk, that suddenly he entreated his wife with flowing tears, saying, "Even when people take shelter together under the same tree, or dip water from a single stream, it must be because strong karma ties from many lives bind them together. Close indeed must be your union with me, who have cherished you tenderly for more than 3 years, yet uncertainty is the lot of mankind. Since we two share an eternal vow, let your woman's heart remain chaste to the end if you should hear that my body has passed into nothingness, and perform holy rites for my sake in the after existence." Now, that's obviously a pretty weird thing to say out of nowhere, and, of course, Yorikazu's wife, who is not given a name, asks her husband what's going on, that he felt he had to wake her up in the middle of the night to remind her to be chaste if he dies. And then, quote, "The shallow-minded man spoke to her again, 'Know then that the emperor has favored me with such a command as I did not dream of, and places his trust in me. Thus I have become party to an imperial revolt, for there is no way to draw back. Yet not by one chance in 1,000 may I escape death. With heavy heart I spoke to you just now, made sorrowful by the parting that is sure to come. But this is a most serious matter, do not let anyone learn of it.' And of course she immediately tells her father, for, she says, the imperial revolt will probably fail, but if it doesn't, she has quite a few relatives on the Hojo side too, who would also suffer and die. Her father, in turn, summons Yorikazu and cajoles him almost immediately into giving up all the names of all the conspirators. You can pretty much guess where things go from there. Agents of the Hojo clan, which dominates the Kamakura shogunate, specifically the group of Hojo-affiliated samurai stationed in Kyoto known as the Rokuhara Tandai, whose job it is to keep an eye on the court, attack a planned meeting of the conspiracy and kill all involved. It's all pretty predictable, though I do want to highlight one of the more badass moments in the whole story, belonging to one of the conspirators, Ogasawara Magaroku. Quote, rubbing his eyes and gazing sharply in the 4 directions, Magaroku beheld above the earthen wall, behind which the conspirators are plotting, a banner bearing a crest fashioned after the manner of a carriage wheel, used by followers of the Hojo clan. And he turned within, shouting to the others in a great voice, "Assuredly is the imperial design laid bare, for attackers from Rokuhara stand against us. Arise, warriors, let each man fight until the very hilt ornaments of his sword give way, and let each cut open his belly at the last." With a corselet slung across his body, he ran up to the gate tower carrying a closely wound rattan bow and 24-arrow war quiver, drew forth an arrow from the middle of the quiver, fitted it along the string, and opened the boards of a window to make a peaked hole. And shouting down, he spoke a word to the enemy, "Soon will you know the degree of our skill, pretentious host. Who may your grand marshal be? Let him approach to receive one of my arrows." Speaking, he pulled back the bowstring until with a singing sound the arrow flew away, that measured 12 hands in the breadth of 3 fingers. Its arrowhead hit square in the middle of the foremost rider's helmet and drove through cleanly to the first neck plate, so that he fell headlong from off his horse. Thereafter, Magaroku shot rapidly, striking as he willed whether in the armor sleeve, the skirt, or helmet bowl until 24 warriors were stricken by his arrows. But when one arrow remained in his quiver, he drew it forth and set the quiver falling down lightly from the tower, saying, "This single arrow do I retain to guard my journey into the netherworld." Then he put the arrow into his belt and cried out in a mighty voice, saying, "Look well that you may tell others how the bravest man in Japan kills himself after joining a conspiracy." And he sprang down headfirst from the tower with the point of his sword in his mouth, so that the sword bit into him and killed him. Now I want to highlight this part of the story for a few different reasons, though I do promise not to quote it quite that length again. First, of course, Magaroku's death is just fantastic and really gives you a sense of how over the top the action of the Taiheiki can be. I mean, he's shooting arrows that are, almost 2 feet long and as thick as a small tree branch before leaping off a tower to eat a sword? That's crazy. It's a very similar way of narrating action to Heike Monogatari, which, again, not that shocking. It is, after all, in a way, a sequel to the text. Much of the battle sequences in both stories involve descriptions of the great deeds of individual warriors, which is a reflection of the origins of these warrior epics in the practice of appeasing dead spirits with songs of their deeds. Second, and more importantly, the way the Taiheiki narrates these events fits with a larger pattern that I want to draw your attention to. In our recent series on Minamoto no Yoshitsune, we spent a good amount of time talking about the frankly not so great treatment of Shizuka, Yoshitsune's lover and companion, who really in the narrative sense gets screwed over pretty badly. Taiheiki handles its female characters quite similarly. The Gunki Monogatari as a genre tend to reflect an understanding of history derived from Confucianism, where the fundamental force that moves history is in fact individual virtue. Dating back to some of the oldest written histories from China, like the Classic of History composed by Sima Qian 1400 years before Taiheiki was written, you see this exact pattern. What causes the movement of history is never anything big or structural, like financial mismanagement or bad harvests or structural shifts in the culture. It's always that a person or people who drive the action either have virtue or don't. Their individual virtue or lack thereof is what shapes events. If you studied Chinese history at all at some point in your life, you've probably heard of the idea of the mandate of heaven, and in particular the notion that a lack of virtue causes a ruler to lose said mandate, and the loss of the mandate of heaven is then reflected in social and political instability. Personal virtue is political virtue, and vice versa. That same pattern got adopted into the writing of Japanese history as far back as the written record in Japan itself goes, and the Gunki Monogatari reflect the exact same dynamic. We saw last week how Go-Daigo, because he is in essence the protagonist of the story, is described as a deeply virtuous man, even though a cursory examination of his actual history as the emperor muddies those waters at least a little bit. And Go-Daigo is a great person to look at here. He is virtuous, according to the author of Taiheiki, and yet his plot is foiled. Later on, his attempt to overthrow warrior rule will prove less successful than he could have hoped. How could that happen? His personal virtue in a Confucian line of thinking should be reflected in political virtue and success. Well, there has to be someone else whose lack of virtue is to blame, and in this case it is the weak-willed coward Toki Yorikazu, and the reason Toki lacks virtue is, of course, his wife. And this is a classic go-to in Confucian histories. Very often the reason men falter is the bad influence of a woman who is too concerned with personal needs over the demand of honor and faithfulness. The Taiheiki includes this detail, therefore, to reflect its background and the tropes of Confucian-inspired storytelling. Anyway, the first plot to overthrow the Hojo is foiled through the lacking moral virtue of some of the participants, and of course some of their spouses. And things are bad in Kyoto. Quote, "In this year no poets offered up verses in Chinese and Japanese, nor were there any musicians to play upon strings and reeds, for it was a time of disorder in the realm. The great nobles and courtiers who chanced to be serving at night knit their brows and lowered their heads, for it was a time when men's spirits faltered, cold terror gripped them, and they asked themselves, who will be the next to suffer from the disturbances of this world?" Fortunately for Go-Daigo, none of the people the Hojo caught ratted him out, and that combined with a letter written back east to the Hojo court at Kamakura professing his ignorance of the plot, kept any suspicion from falling on the emperor, at least this time. I do want to mention one other detail from this moment in Taiheiki. When the letter arrives in Kamakura, Hojo Takatoki orders the letter read to him despite a warning from one of his own retainers, quote, "Never has a son of heaven deigned to grant a message directly to a military subject, either in another country or our own. Will there not be danger from watching gods and Buddhas if heedlessly you open and read it? Would it not be proper simply to return it to the imperial commissioner, not opening the box in which the letter is contained?" Takatoki, of course, does not listen because he is a man without virtue. He instead orders one of his subordinates to read the letter to him. Said subordinate reads the first line, "Let the sun goddess be the witness that the imperial heart is not false. before he is, quote, blinded, blood dripping from his nose, and he withdrew without reading the rest. From that day forth, a swelling came out at the base of his throat, so that within 7 days he died, spitting up blood. That's right, the guy who reads the Emperor's letter gets the full Raiders of the Lost Ark treatment. And despite the suspicions of many in Kamakura, literal divine intervention is convincing enough that Go Daigo escapes without any punishment. Which again is reflective of Taiheiki in its best and worst ways. It's over the top and fun and kind of ridiculous. Heike Monogatari generally keeps things a bit more grounded. Even, for example, the storm that grounds Minamoto no Yoshitsune's fleet is just rumored to be caused by vengeful spirits. But that's not Taiheiki. There's no room for anything subtle here. Now, we're going to skip past a bit of the action of the next few chapters because, frankly, it's not that interesting. A lot of Hojo loyalists investigating the Emperor, various natural disasters, calamities that are interpreted as proof of the unsettled nature of the times, all that stuff. Ultimately, of course, Go Daigo comes under suspicion yet again, and in 1331 he is forced to flee Kyoto with the 3 imperial regalia that mark him as the legitimate ruler of Japan. He and his favored son, Prince Morinaga, who we talked about last week, retreat to Kasagi-dera, a Buddhist temple on the eastern outskirts of Kyoto, and there they begin to rally the Buddhist temples of the region to their cause. Remember, most of these temples have big landholdings with armies of their own to defend them, so they were a potential way for the court to find military support. More important for us, though, is what happens to Go Daigo while he is at Kasagi-dera. The Taiheiki relates that Go Daigo is concerned about the fate of his uprising. Yes, people are coming to support him, but no one of consequence or real importance has come to his side yet. Consumed with worry that his rebellion is going to fizzle, Go Daigo has a dream, and in that dream he sees a throne, facing south, shaded by a tree. 2 children then appear and say, quote, "Nowhere in the tall realm may you hide even briefly, yet beneath that tree there is a seat facing south. Sit there a while, it was made ready for your sake." Now, facing south has a lot of significance here. In the traditional geographic arrangement of a Chinese palace, the person of honor or distinction sits facing to the south. Go Daigo, putting this together, was convinced the dream was a revelation from the gods designed to show him how to proceed. And in Chinese characters, if you combine the character for tree with the character for south, you get the character for a camphor tree, or in Japanese, kusunoki. The emperor then begins to ask around when he wakes up, "Are there any warriors who've come to my cause, whose surname is Kusunoki?" And one Kusunoki Masashige is summoned to his side and asked, "Do you have a plan to win the war against the Hojo?" Here is how Masashige replies, quote, "Not by opposing strength against strength will we triumph, even if we assemble together the warriors of more than 60 provinces to contest against the men of Musashi and Sagami, which is where the power base of the Hojo is. But if we fight with a plan, there will be nothing to fear, since guileless Eastern barbarians can do nothing beyond smashing what is sharp and destroying what is strong. Since the way of warfare is as it is, let not the sovereign look at the outcome of a single battle. While he hears that Masashige alone still lives, let him believe that he will prevail at last." So, in other words, the Hojo are tough, but they are dumb, and we can beat them because of that. Now, alongside Go Daigo himself, Kusunoki Masashige is probably the most important figure in the whole Taiheiki. Debatably even more so than Emperor Go Daigo, he is the protagonist. He, as we will see, is remade by this story into a legend that is quite literally larger than life, and in fact, if you are in Tokyo right now, take a moment, go over to the Imperial Palace. In the southeast corner of the public grounds, you will find a statue of him. That's how big of a reputation he has. But after his initial introduction, Kusunoki Masashige dips back out of the narrative of Taiheiki and doesn't really come back until later. The next part of the text is concerned with the Hojo forces that attack Kasagi-dera and eventually capture Go Daigo. The emperor is imprisoned at this point at the Byodo-in, the Buddhist temple in Uji, before being carted before the Rokuhara Tandai. Quote, "Was it not sad? Yesterday he sat on the imperial dais in the Shishinden with the 100 officials dressed in their ceremonial robes. Today he goes down into the rude dwelling of the eastern barbarians with the stern gaze of a myriad men of war afflicting his spirit." Truly, time passes and the world changes, happiness vanishes as sadness comes, naught but a dream are the days of life. And with that poetic flourish, Go-Daigo is forced to abdicate the throne, and someone from the rival branch of the imperial line, the Jimyoin branch, takes over. The former emperor is shipped into exile. But of course, that's not the end of it, because Kusunoki Masashige and Prince Morinaga both escape unharmed and set up in nearby Akasaka Castle in the hills around Nara. And there, at long last, Kusunoki Masashige will prove his early predictions right. The Hojo are brave, but they are not smart. And that is their weakness. And you see that from the jump. The first cadre of Hojo warriors who arrive at Akasaka are utterly unimpressed by the defenses. A single wood and plaster wall, no more than 20 or 30 towers, and a single fortification no more than a few hundred yards around. They are so unimpressed, in fact, that they remark, "What a pitiable spectacle the enemy presents. Even if we were to hold this castle with one hand and throw, we would be able to throw it. Let us hope that in some strange manner Kusunoki will endure for at least a day, that by taking booty and winning honor we may obtain future rewards." In other words, this place is such a dump, we'll get no honor from taking it, so hopefully this guy can make it worth our while. And of course, dramatic irony being what it is, he sure does at that. Quote, "Now by nature Masashige was a man who would scheme in his tent to defeat an enemy 1,000 leagues distant, one whose counsels were as subtle as though sprung from the brain of Chunping or Zhang Liang, who were two of the advisors of the first emperor of the Han dynasty and brilliant strategists. And he has a whole host of designs laid in store for his enemies. I'm not going to go through them all because I really only want this to be a two-parter, but it's quite something. There's a whole series of ambushes and counter-ambushes that hold the ground for a long time before Masashige is able to cleverly sneak away. He's also saved at one point by a literal piece of divine intervention yet again. An arrow that would have killed him at one point is deflected by a copy of a sutra he keeps tucked in his armor, because it turns out that trope is actually older than you'd think. Anyway, if you've somehow slept through the whole performance up to this point, now you should be pretty clear on which side has the favor of the gods. And again, by the way, this is not the only moment of divine intervention in addition to the magic face-melting letter. At a later point, in actual Tengu, one of the winged goblin figures associated with Japan's sacred mountains, will use his tricks to rally forces against the Hojo and for the emperor by zooming around the massive northern province of Echigo in order to spread news of the rebellion so that local warriors from this far-flung place can join in it more rapidly. These sorts of things, again, would be implied in Heike Monogatari at most. Taiheiki is much less subtle about which side is the right side. Anyway, the plot leaves Kusunoki Masashige for a moment to cover some more dramatic deaths and side characters and return to Hojo Takatoki for a bit to focus on his moral failings, his vain love of dancing and enjoyment of dogfighting. Honestly, it's mostly pretty skippable. A lot of this is concerned with prophesying the downfall of the Hojo, Sign's importance, a long narrative digression back to the clan's founding figure, who is told by a majestic figure from on high that his family's prosperity is due to him having copied out a great many sutras in the past life. But if his descendants fail to adhere to virtue, he is told, they will not endure past 7 generations. And wouldn't you know it, 7 generations are up, because when the plot returns to Kusunoki, it describes him waging an ongoing guerrilla war against the Hojo. After holding Akasaka Castle and bleeding the Hojo forces dry, he finally retreats, and eventually will gather an army for a climactic battle outside Tennoji in Osaka, where Kusunoki baits the armies of the Hojo into an ambush and destroys them, and then does the same thing to another army, led by one of the best warriors the Hojo have, according to Kusunoki himself, Utsunomiya Jibuno Taiyu. Now, I don't want to talk about Utsunomiya too much here, because A, he's not going to be around that long, and B, I don't want this to go on endlessly, but I do want to note something. Despite being on what is pretty manifestly the side of the bad guys, again, Taiheiki's not subtle here, Utsunomiya is described as, frankly, a pretty good guy. Here's how he responds when agents of the Hojo, the Rokuhara Tandai, the Hojo loyalists in Kyoto, tell him to go out and crush Masashige once and for all. Quote, "There is some doubt about going out with a small force, but since the day of my departure from the Kanto, the homeland of the Hojo, I have been resolved not to cherish my life in an affair of such moment. I shall advance alone to put the battle in array. By no means is it possible for the outcome to be known now, so if I fail, let others be sent forward." He then leaves immediately for battle, which ultimately proves interesting. Kusunoki, having heard of this guy Utsunomiya, retreats immediately from Tennoji without a fight, but comes back a few days later feigning a night attack. He then orders his men to light mini campfires around the area that night, creating the appearance of a much larger army than he has, at which point Utsunomiya decides to retreat. As the narrator of Taiheiki recounts, quote, "Truly would both Utsunomiya and Kusunoki have perished, even as with the fighting of paired tigers or dragons. May it not be that each of them knew this thing in his heart? There was none who did not praise them." And this gets at another aspect of Taiheiki that I think is interesting, one that carries over actually from Heike Monogatari. There are certainly villains in some of these stories. Hojo Takatoki is one here, and in Heike Monogatari, Taira no Kiyomori's lack of piety is described as a big reason for his family's destruction, but while at the big level some causes are more righteous than others, at the level of the people doing the fighting, the moral playground is pretty level. The Hojo warriors are on balance not described as any less valorous than the ones fighting for Go-Daigo in the court. Maybe their commanders are less able because they lack the righteousness to see the justice of the imperial cause. Maybe their hearts are less steadfast, they know they're on the wrong side. But on balance, they are in most cases decent and honorable men. And that sort of heroes on both sides mentality is something you see over and over in later warrior tales, all the way down to the civil wars that brought about the end of feudalism in Japan in the 1860s. It definitely has some roots in Chinese history. You see similar patterns in the classic Confucian histories where even the worst rulers have some loyal men at their side, and that loyalty to a doomed man who doesn't deserve it is presented as a sort of tragic romanticism. I just want to note it here because Utsunomiya is a particularly sharp example. Speaking of ambiguous characterization, as we're getting towards the end of this episode, I really want to talk about one other figure who plays an important role in the Taiheiki going forward. Because while Taiheiki might seem to give most of the credit to the Hojo collapse to Kusunoki Masashige, and a whole heaping of divine punishment helping him along, it's really something else that we know as historians undoes Hojo rule, the defection of several key Hojo supporters. In 1333, one of those defectors, Nittayoshi Sada, would take an army he'd been given by the Hojo in Kamakura to deal with Go-Daigo's rebellion, and instead take that army, turn it around, and burn down Kamakura. According to Taiheiki, he'd been plotting that from the jump, but acted only after he secretly received Go-Daigo's mandate to finish off the Hojo, lest he otherwise be reviled as a traitor who had betrayed his lord. Takatoki in the end commits suicide to avoid capture, but only because his younger kinsmen do it first and shame him when he is hesitant. The other crucial figure in this is, of course, Ashikaga Takauji, who, like Nittayoshi Sada, defects to the cause of the emperor after starting out as a supporter of the Hojo. In the Taiheiki, Takauji first appears as one of the Hojo warriors called up to defend Kyoto from Go-Daigo's armies, even though Takauji is, in modern terms, on vacation. He's sick, and his father has also just died, and like any filial son, he is observing a period of official mourning. And yet he is constantly being badgered by the Hojo. When are you coming back? There's a civil war. We have enemies for you to kill. And this is how Takauji responds, quote, "Not for the space of 3 months have I mourned my father's death, nor yet are my grievous tears dried. Moreover, a disease smites my body, such as will not let me rest from suffering. How distasteful it is that they still summon me to a war of chastisement. It is said that the great are brought low with the passing of time, and the lowly are exalted. Yet Takatoki is but a descendant of Hojo Tokimasa, whose clan long ago came down among the commoners, while I am of the generations of the house of Genji, which left the imperial family not long since. Surely it is good that Takatoki should be my vassal instead of contemptuously handing down orders such as these. If he requires this thing of me one more time, I shall take my kinsmen toward the capital, and shall myself join the cause of the former emperor." Takauji even goes so far at this point as to lie to the Hojo because a few members of their leadership are smart enough to tell he's ambitious, and demand he make a public oath of loyalty to the Hojo family and leave his sons and wife behind in Kamakura before going to Kyoto with his army. He willingly does both, though the narrator of Taiheiki absolves him of the dishonorable act of lying, by means of advice given by one of his retainers. Quote, "Your purpose, Takauji, is to punish wickedness in heaven's stead and beat down unrighteousness for His Majesty Go-Daigo's sake. Moreover, there is a saying, the gods do not recognize pledges. Though you set down the words of a pledge deceitfully, will not the Buddhas and gods protect your loyal resolve? Do not vex your heart that you leave your sons and wife to dwell in Kamakura, for it is a small matter alongside a great one. Let a few retainers abide with the young lords to carry them away and hide them in a time of great peril." I find this a fascinating introduction for Takauji as a character because his loyalty to the throne is not going to last. Together, Ashikaga Takauji, Nitta Yoshisada, and Kusunoki Masashige will finally overthrow the Hojo, and Takauji in particular will be the one who conquers Kyoto on behalf of Go-Daigo. The emperor will return from exile and be restored to the throne, and for 3 years, the emperor will once again actually reign over Japan. But ultimately it won't last. Takauji will rebel and begin his own shogunate, Go-Daigo will flee Kyoto, and for the next several generations there will be civil war in Japan between the followers of Go-Daigo and his successors, set up in Yoshino to the south of Kyoto, and Takauji and his successors along with a puppet emperor they have installed in Kyoto itself. The relative position of the two imperial courts, the Ashikaga puppet one in Kyoto and the Yoshino one of Go-Daigo and his successors in the south, gives us the name of this conflict, the War of the Northern and Southern Courts. Now, the Taiheiki does cover this. Takauji's rebellion begins in chapter 15 out of 40 in the conventional Rufubon text. As we covered last week, though, everything after chapter 12 appears to have been written by different authors than the initial books. Again, there's a lot of theories as to who it might have been, though the usual guesses are all monks who were some combination of directly involved in events and working with second-hand reports from the battlefields of the period. Whoever authored the later chapters, they give us a pretty clear accounting of the failures of Go-Daigo's new government, and in particular, why it failed so badly that one of the emperor's most trusted subordinates ended up rebelling. A big part of the issue from the start was simply the Kyoto aristocracy. Go-Daigo's cause, the restoration of power to the emperor and imperial court, was certainly popular with the ancient Kyoto aristocracy, which predates the imperial capital itself, dating back into the misty past of Japanese history. Many members of that aristocracy had hoped Go-Daigo would govern, to use Helen Craig McCullough's description, so as to, quote, turn back the clock to the days when the military were the humble lackeys of the aristocrats. The emperor, to his credit, did not oblige them and tried to be even-handed between the aristocracy and the samurai who had supported him, treating them as equals, but that just annoyed everybody. The aristocracy because they felt the dream of restoring the old ways was not being honored, where Go-Daigo's samurai were angry because they felt it was ridiculous that a bunch of aristocratic poetry slingers were receiving equal rewards with them when they had risked their literal lives in the name of the emperor's cause. Meanwhile, everybody was annoyed by Go-Daigo's massive spending projects, in particular a rebuild of the imperial palace, which was no longer grand enough to house all of the required organs of his new government or appropriate, in Go-Daigo's mind, to his stature as an actual ruler. Which, fair, but the decision was still very unpopular. The emperor was also spending a lot of money he did not have, quote, though truly the world was disordered from war, the nation was wearied and the people suffered, paper money was made, such as was not used in our country from ancient times until the present, and taxes and requisition of labor were laid on the lands of the stewards and housemen of all the provinces. Wherefore many men of understanding knit their eyebrows, saying, it is contrary to the will of the gods and extremely arrogant. All of this was particularly problematic for the samurai who had fought for the emperor, because remember, samurai did not fight for free. Loyalty was not a one-way street. The expectation was that loyal service would be met with rewards. But by the end, so many had defected to the emperor's cause that the coffers of the court, which also didn't have like a bureaucracy set up to collect taxes or anything, began to run dry. When angry men with swords say you owe them a lot of money and you can't pay them, that's not ideal. All of this explains why, in general, there were samurai willing to turn on the imperial cause, but why was Ashikaga Takauji willing to lead them? This actually is one of the areas where the Taiheiki is a bit more subtle, maybe because a new author has taken over from the rather ham-fisted writer of chapters 1 through 12, maybe because Takeuji himself works better as an ambiguous figure who is neither fully good nor fully bad. Partially, Takeuji is described as driven by circumstances. The samurai around him are disillusioned with Go-Daigo's rule, and of course as their leader he feels compelled to redress what he sees as unjust treatment for loyal service. He's also driven by personal factors. Takeuji had expected rewards for his service, and in particular to be named to the post of shogun, the commander of the emperor's warriors. Instead, the emperor chose his third son and planned heir, Prince Morinaga, who we talked about last week, and Morinaga, in turn, started plotting, at least Takeuji claimed, to kill Ashikaga Takeuji. Supposedly, the imperial prince suspected, not without justification, that Takeuji coveted his position. This led to a big showdown where Takeuji, who had taken over the old Hojo homeland in Kamakura, demanded that Prince Morinaga be arrested and sent to him for the crime of plotting assassination, which Prince Morinaga denied doing. Ultimately, and kind of shockingly, the emperor agreed to imprison his own son and send him to Takeuji. And Prince Morinaga will actually be executed ultimately by Takeuji's brother, who will do it out of fear the prince would one day serve as a rallying point for enemies of the Ashikaga family. Now, this whole sequence is interestingly portrayed in Taiheiki. It's not really a moment where the text describes blame to anyone. Go-Daigo for imprisoning his own son, Morinaga for planning an assassination, Tadayoshi for literally killing an imperial prince. It's all portrayed as a sort of karmic inevitability. Given the nature of the times and the destinies of both Takeuji and Prince Morinaga, this whole thing couldn't have happened any other way. This is all underscored by a series of dreams importance in the intervening chapters that seem to foretell the coming of civil war, to imply it's almost foreordained. When it does come, Takeuji is hesitant. At first he won't even take command of his family's armies, relying on subordinates to fight the emperor's supporters. He seems torn, uncertain about the whole thing. Now, I don't want to go too in-depth on the Civil War from this point onward, because honestly, at this point, the Taiheiki gets very repetitive, and this is not intended to be a general history of the War of the Northern and Southern Courts. If you're interested, part of our overview series on Japanese history, episodes 515 to 517, go over all this. But we're focused here on Taiheiki as a work of literature, and how it stacks up to Heike Monogatari. Whether maligning Taiheiki is purely derivative of that text is fair. I have spent a lot of time with Taiheiki over the last few weeks, and I kinda get it. There are ways from the constant insistence on referring to the Hojo as the Taira to the rather repetitive battle scenes that are written just like battles from Heike Monogatari, in which this feels like an imitation, and kind of a pale one at that. I mean, if nothing else, Heike has a lot less straight-up divine intervention to move its plot forward. But I do think it's unfair to entirely dismiss Taiheiki because of this. The way Ashikaga Takeuji is written, as ambitious but having genuine loyalty to the court at first, is kind of interesting, especially because in later centuries, his betrayal of the emperor will lead him to be treated as one of the great villains of Japanese history. The period as a whole is fascinating and complicated. Honestly, the main thing I noticed doing these episodes was just how frustrating it was that there's not that much scholarship on Taiheiki relative to Heike Monogatari. Nobody's ever tried to translate past chapter 12 of 40 into English except as fragments. There were apparently plans to make chapters 13 through 19 available at some point, but nobody's gone beyond that. And other than a few folks like Thomas Conlin and Joan Pigot, there's not that much work being done on this that I'm aware of. And that's unfortunate. Taiheiki's genuinely interesting in its own right. If you're interested in the period, if you're interested in the origins of Japanese literature, I think this text, honestly, deserves a day in the sun, warts and all. That's all for this week. Thank you very much for listening. This show is a part of the Facing Backward podcast network. You can find out more about our show at facingbackward.com, and you can support the network on Patreon. Thanks again for listening, and I'll see you next week for the start of a new series on the connection between a part of remote Washington and Japan.